Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. I'll get it out there eventually. Thanks to everyone for coming along and listening to the podcast. We're appreciating the hits that we're getting and the downloads. We're certainly grateful for that because it's just a show of confidence. Do take the time to subscribe. If you haven't already, give us some reviews. We'd appreciate that. And then, of course, tell your friends. Of course, you may not want to tell your competition, but certainly tell your friends, maybe in areas where they're not going to be competing with you. And we'd always love ideas about other talks that you would like us to have. Certainly, my specialty is vertebrate pest control. So reach out to me and tell me what you're interested in. What is my email address? Well, it's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That wildlife control consultant is singular. There's no S on the end of it. And we'd love to hear from you. So I'm on Facebook. I'm also under the Pest Geek podcast area. Make sure you sign up. Glad to have you join us and join the conversation and learn all things vertebrate pest control and also Pest Geek for those of you that do pest control more traditionally. So I've done a presentation on basically review articles, reading scientific literature, and so now I'm transitioning to talking about experimental articles. And these are articles that are publishing the results of a particular study rather than a review article. If you're interested in review articles and they're really cool, check out my other podcast on how to read review articles and their role to help your business. But this one's going to be on how to deal with experimental journal articles and how to read them, because for many wildlife control operators, many of them don't have college education because it's not necessary to be college educated to get into wildlife control. And in some ways, it might actually be a detriment. Hard to say that, but certainly it may not help you to the extent you wish. Certainly some of the education would be helpful, but I want to give you some tips on how you're going to read these journal articles, because I'm a strong believer in accessing the academic literature. The academic literature doesn't answer every question for our industry, and that's certainly true. There's a lot you can learn from your colleagues who have more experience from you, from other professionals, because in a sense we're sort of a guild. There's certain techniques that we know that academics don't know. I was listening to an academic who's working, I believe, on her PhD, talking about trapping mongoose in Puerto Rico. And I looked at the traps that she was using, and I was shocked at how archaic they were. She was still using double door gravity Havahart traps, the one with the solid doors, the kind that were built in the 1970s. And they weren't spring loaded. And I was like, have you heard of the Cania trap or the Coro trap? And she was like, what? And I was amazed that she was having some challenges with some of the trapping. Not that she wasn't a good trapper, she was using equipment that was costing her an enormous amount of time. So there's a lot of things that we know that the academic folks don't know. But it also cuts the other way. And so we need to be sure that we are reaching out and listening to what the academics, the research biologists are doing, because they may come up with a technique or a principle that could really save you a lot of money or perhaps make you a lot of money. So I'm hopeful that you're going to take my advice and start looking at some of the literature, and I'll do a podcast on how you can search for the literature. But I would just give you a clue right now. Google Scholar is what you want to do. All right, so let's get started about these journal articles. So again, the difference between a review article summarizes research over the last several decades, depending on how many articles have been written on a topic. The one I did on my podcast was on deer fences. And so the authors basically read the literature and then summarized the findings of that literature in one place. So think of it like a Cliff Notes for the scientific literature. That's what a review article is. Very powerful. There's review articles on all kinds of topics of interest for wildlife control operators, such as biology. You want to know about the biology, let's say, of a raccoon or a possum or a skunk or a beaver. There are journal articles that basically summarize all that literature in one place, so you can know what is the average weight of a raccoon from all the different literature, all the different articles. What is their average reproductive rate? Things like that. What is their skull size? I mean, it's ridiculous what you can learn from it. Okay, and some things you may think you don't need to know, and then you're going to have a situation where you do need to know. That's a review article. An experimental article is when the researcher is basically performing a test where he asks a research question: does this particular method work? Or in our article that you have here in front of you, how high can a deer really jump? How high of a fence do you know? If you want to have a fence that a deer can't jump, how high do you have to go? So that's what this research was. So this is an experimental research where they basically grabbed a bunch of deer and then tested them to see how high they could jump. That was it. So we're going to talk about how to read this sort of a journal article where you don't have to have a PhD, you don't have to have a biology degree or a science degree and know physics and statistics and all that. All that helps, don't get me wrong, it helps, but you don't have to have that to still glean information from it that can be helpful for your business. So I'm going to try to give you a strategy to help you read this efficiently and to understand how the article is put together so that you know where to get the information you need, and then if you want to get more information, what parts that you can drill down to later on. Because I think every wildlife control operator should try to read one journal article a week. And that's not a lot, because these journal articles are not that long. In fact, this one that I'm going to talk about today is only 4 pages. And you don't even have to read all of it if you don't want to. And you'll still get the main points out of that journal article without losing anything. All right, so let's get started. So the article that I have here in front of you is the Assessment of Abilities of White-tailed Deer to Jump Fences. And it's written by Kurt C. Vercauteren. And the reason why I picked this particular article is because Kurt Vercauteren, the Dr. Kurt Vercauteren, is a biologist, wildlife biologist at the National Wildlife Research Center in Fort Collins, Colorado. And he, as a government worker, his material cannot be copyrighted because he's a federal worker. It's our tax dollars at work. We pay his salary indirectly, obviously, through our taxes. And so this is why I chose this particular article. It's also nice because I think deer is an area that wildlife control operators should be thinking more about exploring the income opportunities available through deer. And it's been hard for us to get into deer because state wildlife biologists know that deer is what pays their salary. And so they're very loath on giving up control of deer. That's why wildlife control operators typically don't get contracts to shoot deer. Although that's changing, that's true, but it's not really opened up the way other species have, because wildlife biologists in states make their living, that's through hunting fees, to pay their salary through deer, so they're really holding on to that. But I think things are going to change over time, and certainly as people begin to realize that they need to have more fences to keep deer out with all the ticks, various diseases with ticks, it's important to think about that. So, make a long story short, this particular study, you will learn right from the title. So when you're looking at journal articles, the titles tend to be very long. And the reason for that is that scientists like to be very specific about the topic that they're dealing with. You will often find the scientific name of the animal if there is one. Now, this one doesn't have the scientific name, but white-tailed deer is narrow enough that you pretty much know what kind of a deer it's dealing with. But you will see the scientific name in the article itself, but often you will see it directly in the title. Next, you will see the authors that created the journal article. And typically with scientific literature, you will find a lot of names. It is not uncommon to have 3, Sometimes you'll have up to 6. Some journal articles have gotten restrictive. Now they're like, look, you can't throw everybody on your journal article. You're going to have to limit it to 7 or whatever. And so some journals actually say you cannot add more than 7 authors. Because sometimes what people would do is they would throw everyone's name on there. They'd like change a letter on the article and get their name in the journal. And they're like, oh, no, we're not doing that. So they have to be substantive authors. And so they've decided to limit that. But this one here has 4 articles because it's a lot of work to do these scientific experiments. And then, of course, it takes time to put the data together for publication. Scientists publish their information so that they can have it critiqued and evaluated by other scientists, and so also that they can share what they've learned, and so that together they can start creating deeper knowledge about the world and life. And so in this case, so that we know more about white-tailed deer. So Kurt Vercauteren, Timothy R. Vandaelen, Michael J. Lavelle, Wayne H. Hall, these individuals have all participated in this particular research project, and that's why their names are on. Now, you may not care about the names, but let me assure you, if you begin to do some continuing reading in the literature, you will begin to recognize certain names coming up into certain topics over and over and over again. And those tend to be researchers who have specialized in a particular area. And so that will tell you, oh, this guy's a real expert in this particular field. Dr. Vercauteren is a world-class researcher in the area of deer. So when you see his name, he does a lot of other research as well, but if you see his name and it's talking about deer, you know you're dealing with some class. And so this is something you would learn, just like when you want to hear someone, like someone in the trapping community or someone in the pest control community that talks about a particular pest control technique. You're like, oh, well, then if he likes it, then it must be good. Well, it's kind of the same thing, because some of these researchers develop a reputation for doing some high-end quality work. Doesn't mean they're perfect. Just means that if you disagree with them, you're going to have to really bring the goods to disagree with them, because they're very careful researchers. Okay, but that's just something you're going to learn over time, and recognize that you will learn that over time. So typically, the first author is the most important, is the one who did the majority of the work. Sometimes the last author is considered sort of the supervisor. So the first author and the last author can often be the most important people within a particular project, with the last author sort of being the overall supervisor, but the first author is always the one who did the majority of the work. I've argued it's always best to be second author, because you get all the glory with very, very little work. So having been primary author, I can assure you, being second author is a whole lot easier. All right. So the next section of the journal article is known as the abstract. Now, the abstract is a very important portion of the journal article. This little paragraph, this one's quite brief, gives you a thumbnail sketch of the entire article. Read the abstract. So you want to read the title. If you're interested in the subject, read the abstract. The abstract will tell you whether it's going to be worth your while to read the rest of the journal article. So, and the beauty is that the abstract is often available outside of the firewall. See, there's a lot of journal articles that are not available through the internet without having a paid subscription. Those articles, you can often glean a lot of quality information just by the abstract, because the researchers do allow the abstract to be public, but not necessarily the entire article. And the abstract is often enough for what we need. So read the abstract. If you can get the whole article, great. Read the abstract. If the abstract is not intriguing enough for you, then you don't need to read the rest of the article. It saves you an enormous amount of time. So make sure you read it. The next section of the journal article is the keywords. Now, the keywords are given to help categorize and collate the particular article for research, for searching purposes. So you can skip that or not. Here you see some keywords that the authors have put in to help people find it when they're searching through various literature databases. That's all that's for. The next section of the journal article, we start getting into the text itself. We start with the introduction. The introduction doesn't say introduction, but that's the introduction. First few paragraphs. The introduction situates what the study research is all about. In other words, it's going to tell you why this particular research question is important, and it will then compare what they're doing with what's happened historically. Have other researchers dealt with this question about how high deer can jump? Why is this researcher doing this project? It's a lot of work to perform an experiment, especially when you're dealing with something as big as a deer. Why are they doing it? So the introduction justifies and explains the rationale for what they were trying to discover and why other research didn't answer the question completely. So sometimes researchers, they will repeat an experiment, so you will then see an explanation as why they're repeating the experiment. But other times there'll be a new experiment because they're saying previous experiments did not answer the question that everyone had in mind, or previous literature research gave us information that raised another question that we hadn't previously thought of. I hope they got all that. It's pretty complicated, all right? So that introduction is critically important, and you'll get a lot of interesting stuff about that. So here what they're saying is deer fencing is important to protect deer from disease and transmitting disease because of these deer farms. Now, deer farms in a lot of states are being banned, or if their people have been grandfathered in, then once that person goes out of business and is not able to sell, then the state is taking over and they're not allowing any more deer farms. The reason because of disease. So the issue of keeping deer inside a particular enclosure is critical, because if those deer get CWD or something else, you don't want deer being able to get out by jumping the fence. So how high do those fences need to be? So they're talking about this. And then it goes down further and it says the height required to keep deer from jumping a fence has not been quantified. And there's my paragraph right here. Let me put it right at the top of the screen for you. Right here, this paragraph on the left. The height, let me highlight it here for you. The height required to keep deer from jumping a fence has not been quantified. There's your justification for why they're doing this particular experiment. So how high is that fence? Do you know? Well, this article is basically up to this point the definitive answer to that question. Intrigued? We'll keep going. So the next section here is they're getting into the methods. Now this is, they call it the study area, which is they're telling you where they performed their research, but that's really part of the method. And then they get into officially a paragraph, the section called the methodology, where they give you the time, the type of equipment they were using, and how they set up the experiment. You can skip that if you want. The methods, if you have to skip a portion of the research that's listed here, skip the methods. And that's what I'm going to recommend to you, because that's what was recommended to me when I was starting to learn about how to read scientific literature, because I'm not a scientist. Okay, I read a lot of scientific literature. I like to learn about science, but I'm not a trained scientist in that regard. I have received training, but I don't have a degree in traditional science, despite what my master's degree says. It tells you what they did, how they did it, how they structured the experiment. Here we even have a picture of what they were doing. So let me just I'm sure you're probably intrigued by this particular article. What they had was a fence. They had a big plot of ground, put a fence in the middle, and then they basically were feeding the deer, and they had video cameras, and they would stress the deer in some instances and not stress the deer in others, and to see if they could get them to jump the fence. And then, of course, they kept raising the fence over time to see how high they could go. That's kind of the experiment in a nutshell. Okay, really cool. And it's exciting research that they did. I mean, I'm excited about it because this is what I like science for, because it answers a real question. It's not saying, you know, how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin. Okay, this is real stuff here. And it's not just answering sometimes silly questions that sometimes scientists that we fund for. This is some really quality stuff here. So they continue to talk about their location and what they did and how they set up the experiment. And that's what all this is here. All this reading here is all about how they set up the experiments, because they did several tests to get the answer that they're looking for, because they're trying to get something that's going to be statistically valid. Remember, all of reality is, you're probably familiar with the bell curve, right? The bell curve said that there's a majority of instances in the middle, and then you have what's called the outliers and the wings. And so just like you have that crazy uncle, most people, their behavior is within a certain level of parameters, but there's always people at the outside that kind of do things just a little bit different. Wildlife are the same thing. That's why you always want to be careful of saying animal X never does this. Not true, because you may find a raccoon that does something weird on you, and it doesn't mean it's abnormal for raccoon. It just means an animal is just not in the mainstream of animal behavior. Okay, well, that's why they wanted to have something statistically valid, so they needed to use enough deer and use enough experiments to get the kind of information to make it statistically worthy. If they just tested one deer, that wouldn't be enough, right? You would say, well, maybe they just had a really weak deer. Or they had a Michael Jordan deer who was able to jump incredibly high. So that's why you get several animals to make sure that you have enough to get a good representative sample of what a deer can normally do. And that's what they did. So let me keep going down. We talked about the methods section. We're going to keep going. We have our little picture there. Diagram. It's always nice to see some diagrams. And then we start getting into our charts. Here's all the experiments they did. And again, you can skip all this. You say, I'm not telling you to ignore it per se, unless if you like getting into this, because it can get a little technical. But I'm telling you, you want to then skip the methods, get right down into the results. And this is the raw data in English. Okay. So they're going to tell you what happened. And so they're going to say experiment 1. Notice they put the dates in there. They used 22 deer, 11 females, 9 adults, 2 yearlings of those 11 males, because they tried to make it even for gender, right? 7 adults, 4 yearlings. And then they conducted 7 trials with those deer as a group. And they did this over, and they progressed ultimately to a height of a fence 2.4 meters. Remember, in scientific literature, it's always generally going to be done in metric. Okay, so if you're having trouble figuring out what some of the metric is, I use an app that actually converts metric into, American distances and weights and that sort of thing. So, and after a while, you'll start learning what the equivalence is, and you just do it in your head. But the point is that they start telling you what they were able to get these deer to do and what their results were. After you want to read the results. The results are what they found straight on. The next section is the discussion, and that's where they give you their interpretation of that result. What are the implications of that material? Did they have issues with their experiment? That will all come out in the discussion. They will tell you why they had to maybe eliminate a deer from the study period. They may have had to tell you some of the challenges. Maybe the weather went bad, or the ground got slippery, or they had an equipment failure. And they would explain what they thought about the data and the results that they collected, what its value was. And that's the discussion. You want to read the discussion. The discussion, if you have a choice between the discussion and the results, read the discussion. Now, the key here is understand that the discussion is partly their interpretation of their results. Now, their opinion really matters, but again, their opinion isn't sacrosanct. So when you start learning and start reading a lot more, you're going to be able to start criticizing what you're seeing. You say, well, Stephen, I'm never going to criticize it. I'm not a scientist. Trust me, if you're really paying attention, you will learn. You're like, well, why did they do this? Or I saw a deer do this. Remember, all of you have experience with wildlife as well. Sure, you don't have a degree up on the wall necessarily that you're some big high-powered biologist, but you're a naturalist and you've learned things as well. It doesn't mean you get arrogant. It doesn't mean that the researchers are lying to you. It means that sometimes we perceive things through our own lens, and sometimes we misunderstand something. We miss a causal effect. Perhaps there's another way to look at the data. So not talking about lying or deception here. I'm not referring to that at all. I'm just saying is that you can be a critical reader. And by critical, I don't mean just harsh. I mean, you're reading the material carefully to see if there's weaknesses. Did the researchers make a mistake? Now, it's going to be unlikely that you will find it because these articles are peer-reviewed when we're getting into some of these journal articles. This is from, I think, the Wildlife Society. So I think this is the Journal of Wildlife Management. Let me see. Yeah, Journal of Wildlife Management, because here's our section up here, gives you the reference. Okay, Journal of Wildlife Management, that's produced by the Wildlife Society. I am a member of the Wildlife Society. You can be a member of the Wildlife Society. They're a great group, and there's some really good information. Membership alone gives you access to the historical journals of the Journal of Wildlife Management and the Wildlife Society Bulletin. So that alone is worth the price, and I think it's under $100. So you can have enough reading there forever. Okay, there's some really great stuff there. So read the discussion, read it carefully, think about how you can take the information that you have here and apply it to your business. So we're going to get down, so we're going to look at some of this and notice what they did. I'm going to just look at this sentence here. Because this individual did not jump the test fence during either the 2.1 meter drive, that's when they were driving the deer, they're putting the deer under stress to see if they can jump higher over the fence. We released it before the 2.4 millimeter trial, so we do not know whether it had the ability. See, they're explaining a problem that they had in their experiment. One of the deer they got rid of because the deer didn't jump a lower fence. They were also, notice how they commented here, we were surprised by the lack of deer jumping the 2.4 meter fence. So post hoc, that means after the fact, we surveyed, after the fact means after their experiment was done, they surveyed over 150 wildlife biologists who routinely observed deer in the proximity to fences. And they found 6 who had witnessed deer jumps above 2.4 meters. How much is 2.4 meters? That's an 8-foot fence. They found 6 wildlife biologists who said, oh yeah, I saw a deer clear an 8-foot fence. That's impressive, right? Now, that wasn't part of their experiment, but they did that research for you. So when you have a client saying, how high does my fence need to be? You're going to say 8 feet, but understand when push comes to shove, some deer may jump that. So if the person tells you, I have to have 100% assurance a deer will not jump this fence, then you got to make sure you're higher than 8 feet, or you construct that fence with some distance to keep a deer away from jumping that fence. However, for the vast majority of situations, an 8-foot fence does the job. And in some cases, if the deer are not stressed, you probably can get away with something lower than that. So you can have like a 7-foot high fence and maybe put some barbed wire at the top to make up the extra difference. That might save a lot of money in terms of the weight of the fence and the amount of money you're paying. Okay. Anyways, what this study does, it says notice what it says here. We incrementally increased the height of the test fence in experiment 1 because we assumed that deer accustomed to jumping and progressively stimulated to jump higher would effectively represent the best jumpers in the overall population. So they're giving you the rationale for why they did what they did in their experiment. And their conclusion here, deer in our study, progressively trained or not, that is, some deer learned to jump higher as they were forced to, other deer that weren't being forced, weren't being trained, none of the deer jumped a 2.4 meter fence. However, because of their survey, they know that there are some deer who are just super jumpers that can clear an 8-foot fence. They're saying if you want like a 95%, 98% certainty, 8 feet's enough. Because you don't have to make your house Fort Knox to stop most burglars. Okay. But there's always going to be a few burglars who can break in your house. Right? So that's kind of how you need to help your clients. The same thing with raccoons. You know that you can do certain things to a house that are going to keep out most raccoons. However, there could be that one raccoon that just for some reason wants to get in, and he's getting in. But you can't price every job that way. Right? No client would ever hire you. So you just have to let the customer know this is good. It's not perfect. Because nothing ever really is it? So the bottom line of this publication is 8-foot fence. If you want to go 100% certainty, as it says here, more than 8 feet would be justified if 100% deterrence is needed. If you need to be absolutely sure you're keeping every deer out of your property, it's got to be taller than 8 feet. That's it. The rest of the publication, now you're going to get into some acknowledgments where they're thanking people who assisted in the project but weren't necessarily big enough assistance to justify being in the authorship. And then they're going to give you the literature cited. The literature cited can be quite helpful if you want to explore additional information on this particular subject on a historical basis. So bottom line for this particular publication is 8-foot fence, good enough. You need 100% security, got to go bigger than 8 feet. And this is the data that justifies that level of a decision. So in summary, to kind of do the highlights again, read the title. If the title is interesting for you, move down, read the abstract, then read the introduction, skip the methods. Let me scroll down here a little bit more. Get to the results. If you're really pressed for time, skip the results, go right to the discussion. And then read the results. And if you're still interested, then read the methodology. And if you want to learn more, go down into the bibliography, the works cited, and you can find additional resources. That is how you read an experimental journal article. And I hope this helps diffuse some of maybe the fear or the apprehension of reading this material, because I'm telling you, in order for you to be better than your competition, you have got to know something different from your competition. So don't be like them. Just try to read a little bit. One article a week. This was only 4 pages. Not a lot of time. I mean, put it by the toilet. After a few days, you probably get through it all, right? So, and you will find your knowledge deepening, and you're going to see something that's going to pique your interest and say, how do I incorporate that into my business? Can I make money with this? And I think you'll find it being very helpful. So let's give a kudos up here for Dr. Ricotta and his team. Assessment of abilities of white-tailed deer to jump fences. It was a fascinating article, and there's a lot more like it on a whole host of topics. So I hope you found that to be helpful. Keep reading, keep learning, keep listening to our podcast. I'm Stephen Vantassel, wildlife control consultant, giving you another episode of Living the Wildlife. Why? Because I want you to live the wildlife. I don't want you to be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.